My name is Jack Canfora, and I am a playwright and sometimes actor and artistic director of the online theater company New Normal Rep.
And I saw that it looked like acting came first for you. Is that true or?
It is true. Yeah, I sort of fell into a bad crowd as an actor and ended up writing plays. I started out in theater, wanting to be an actor and do Shakespearean acting in particular. And then as I got older, that became less tenable because I had a family and I was going to get a day job, and I sort of segued into playwriting. I was in a sketch comedy troupe, so I wrote a lot of sketch material, and then I found eventually that I was able to. My best way of staying connected to the performing arts world was by writing because I could do that and still have a full time job. And as it turned out, I think that was a better path for me anyway.
Yeah, what was the full-time job? I'm sure there were a few,
I
but
was a
what was the?
teacher for many years, which I
Oh, wow.
loved. It was great. I was an English teacher, and it was great training for me actually as a writer because I'm teaching all of these great plays, and it's really um, great training because like I ended up having to study it, study them in depth and sort of get under their skins, so to speak. And it's a real great training. There's that cliche: if you want to learn something, teach it, and that certainly was true for me.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and I'm always interested to ask this question to every single guest, but if you can recall that moment where you found a connection or an attachment to the performing arts, do you remember when that happened for you?
Oh, I mean, I think like a lot of people. I mean, it's almost a cliched answer, but when I was excuse me, when I was young, when I was a little kid, I moved around a lot with my parents. My father was in a job, and he kept on, getting promoted, which was very nice. But with his business, but I kept on moving from place to place, and so I was always sort of the odd kid out. I was always the new kid, and I was, pretty marginally weird to begin with. And so you put those two things together, and so I was often on the outside looking in. And when I was in, I guess it was really high school, early high school, maybe before then, when I auditioned for plays and got in and got reasonably good roles. It was the first place I felt connected to people. It was the first way I could feel part of any sort of community in any real sense, and so that's pretty intoxicating to say the least. And so that's what it was for me. It was only later when I realized that I perhaps had some facility for it, and it was also a discipline and a craft that I really admired and wanted to pursue. That probably was around college. By the time I realized, because it was always something that I just assumed would fall away as I
Mhm.
moved on in my life, and then I realized that it was a lot more important to me than almost anything else I was doing. And so it went from being just a great um, self-validating, reaffirming community and fun to those things, but also something that I really needed to work at. And there's nothing. There are few better feelings in the world than really pouring real effort into something that you really love. So there you
Yeah,
go.
what about the performance aspect of theater, made you feel comfortable? I mean, a lot of people have common
Mm.
stage fright, right? So did you
Yeah.
feel just an innate comfort jumping onto the stage?
Yeah, I don't think I suffered much stage fright. I mean, I'm sure I had butterflies certainly, certainly before opening night or whatever, but it was always something that I welcomed. It was even the butterflies were fun, which sounds like the world's worst hippie poem. um, but yeah, even that was sort of thrilling and addictive in a weird sort of way, and it gave me confidence. And not to get too maudlin and psychological about it. I mean, I also got to it enabled me to kind of have attention on me in a positive way without the burden of it really having to be me. So when I was on the stage, I didn't have to be me, which was an enormous relief in all sorts of ways. Um, and it was incredibly validating. People, it was to be that age and to be sort of an outsider and to have people um, uh, be positive to you or towards you in any way is gold.
Yeah, and you know what? If you don't mind me asking, I think there's a commonality with performers, creatives, and that idea of feeling like you're an outsider or an outlier within your peer group. What,
Mm.
if you wouldn't mind going into detail, what made you feel like an outsider? What made you feel weird?
Well, I think a lot of it was the constantly being the new kid around. Um, I, I mean, there were a few factors. That was the main one. The other one was that I was a really voracious reader, which, as a little kid, and which didn't by any stretch mean that I was smarter than the other kids at all, but it meant that I talked differently than the other kids. And so I was sometimes a little baffling, I think, to my peer group in ways that I couldn't understand because to me it was just the way I would, talk. I mean, it's not that I was speaking in iambic pentameter, but I mean, if you use a three-syllable word, in fourth grade, you're labeled as bizarre, and that sort of, preceded me. So it's not that believe me, it's not that I was smarter than the other kids. It was just that that I read a lot. I was an only child until I was 9. I moved constantly, so my only escape was books, and so I was constantly filling my head with, these stories and this language, and so I think it made it a little harder for me to acclimatize myself to new environments.
I definitely believe it as a book, just a bookworm myself, especially in elementary school, reading books that were years ahead. There
Yeah,
were moments where you had to, recede back a little bit when you're talking to your friends and say, "Oh no, I meant this." Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Exactly. I didn't mean to say forsooth there. Yeah, I mean, and I wasn't necessarily good at maybe you were good at recalibrating. I wasn't necessarily I was a bit, I guess, stubborn and or obtuse and didn't really recalibrate the way I should have. And so I think some of it was that, to be sure. But yeah, I would lay a lot of it on the fact that I, was always the new kid in town, and plus also I had like apparently I don't even remember this, but I had apparently like what these call like pigeon toes, like pigeon feet, which is like your feet kind of go in a little bit,
Yeah.
although not really. But what they had in the 70s are these are special shoes, these orthotic shoes, which it's like they got grant money to design the ugliest worst looking shoes possible. And so all these other kids, wearing sneakers and stuff like that. And I'm wearing these like things from a Victorian novel. And so that didn't really help me much either. Didn't up my cool factor.
Well, all of that experience as a child sort of I feel like that shaped you into the artist you are now. You have a
Yeah.
an empathy that I'm sure you wouldn't have had if you
And empathy and a and
had
a
blended
and
in.
and a and a and a better taste in shoes. Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
think that's true. I mean, it runs in my family a lot of um I from a very early age suffered from real depression. I mean, looking back on it now, I think, oh my gosh, I was really, really clinically depressed. Even like I can remember feeling things at 3 that I look at now as an adult and say, "Oh, that's real severe clinical depression." And so, that are also absolutely has informed who I am as a person and who I am as a writer, to be sure.
Yeah. Is there a connection you have to the characters you write then, when it comes to addressing mental health and
Well,
depression?
sometimes several of my characters tend to have that as an issue that they wrestle with. Not all of them by any stretch, but a lot of them. And
Mm,
in fact, my theater company's radio play now, which is out on podcast platforms. The central character is someone who struggles with depression. That's not the through line. I mean, that's not the plot, but it's part of her makeup and backstory. And so, yeah, certainly there's a tendency for me to gravitate towards those characters a bit because the cliche is right, which but um, so I think, but I think talking earlier, what you were saying about like, the bad things helping inform the good, I wouldn't wish depression on anyone. Having said that, I do think that whatever abilities I have, whatever virtues as a human being I may have, are certainly augmented, if not actually created, by my depression.
mm.
I think I don't think I'd be nearly as aware of other people. I don't think I would be as empathetic, and not and believe me, not that I'm a font of empathy, but I mean, to the whatever degree I can find myself empathizing and recognize empathy as a real virtue, that's certainly it's been informed by my depression. And and it's an incredibly humbling thing too, right? Because I've made, I've done things in my life or failed to do things in my life that, are sources of, regret. And boy, this has gotten often taken a very dark turn. But I mean, but what they've done is they've allowed, it's very humbling. It allows you to realize that you're, you're incredibly vulnerable as a person, and everyone's incredibly vulnerable as a person. And so, be, kinder to other people than maybe you'd like to be, and be kinder, to yourself, which is something I still sort of wrestle with. But um, yeah, so I think that depression is, again, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I do think it can be very. It's a strict, unfair, and cruel teacher, but it does teach you things.
Absolutely. And as somebody who's fought with that my entire life, and I still do, even with
Yeah.
therapy and whatever medication you may take, yeah, it's the greatest teacher I've ever had, and I would never
Mm.
recommend it to someone else.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
But it
Yeah.
is, it does feel very cathartic when you can utilize, whatever you're feeling during those episodes and
Yeah.
place it within the art or put it onto a page and dive
Yeah.
into writing.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very much a great, um well, at this point, it's just I've done it for so long that it's become so habituated, in my behavior, and so hardwired into my sense of who I am, that, I I literally don't know what I would do if I didn't write, and it's not, uh so in a sense, it's just a way of, and it's a great way to escape into things too, right? It's a great way because it's a different world, you have complete control of that world, um, and but it's also allows you, it's like a lab in which you can look through the emotions you're feeling. When I write, I usually write to figure out what I feel. Like, I don't know what I feel about something as I'm, my impetus for me for writing a play, or TV show or whatever, is almost never I would like to talk about this. It's always, I wonder what it would feel like to be this, and I don't know how I feel about that. So let me try and write and discover it.
Wow, you know what? I do want to. On that note, I do want to ask you what the process was like when you wrote your first play that ended up being produced. What was that
Yeah.
experience like for you, from writing it to the first day of tech rehearsals?
Yeah, it was, well, I was very lucky in that the first full-length play I wrote, was actually produced, by the New Jersey Repertory, Company, which is a small but very nice, very good, very well-respected, theater company, and it was a very strange experience. Now, I'd been writing sketches for a couple of years at that point, and it was a great, um, teacher writing sketch comedy, because you'd write it, and then, like, within a week, sometimes within a day or two, you'd put it up on its feet in front of an audience, and it would either work or it really wouldn't work. And that's, talk about teaching. That's the best teacher of all. That's better. I haven't taken any, like, formal writing classes, but I feel like that was as good a learning, a good a system to learn as any. And so when I started to write, it was very much a self-conscious thing to see if in fact I could write a play. It was very much, um, well, I'm not gonna be able to act anymore because now I've got a day job and I've got a mouth to feed. Um, and so writing maybe is a way to stay connected in some way. And so I actually wrote a couple small one-act plays just to see if I could maybe do it. And I thought, okay, maybe. And then so I said, okay, let me see if I can write this play just to see if I can write it. Um, and yeah, I don't think it's a great play looking back on it, but it was, um, I workshopped it and, spent a lot of time with it, and, it eventually got, produced, which, again, very lucky in a lot of ways to do that. But it was an amazingly steep learning curve. It was an amazingly steep learning curve. Um, but it was wonderful. At the time, I hadn't really fully punted on the idea of acting. And so, in fact, I wrote the play with a role for me in mind, and so I actually acted in it too, which I've come to find is actually, for me, it's much harder to act in a play of mine than it is to act in someone else's play, because, um, the most basic requirement as an actor you need, and that's demanded of you, is that you be attentive and fully listening to your other actors. And while I would do that, part of my brain would also be saying, "Well, I don't think that line really is." landing the way I'd like it to. I think it needs a trim. And so when the minute you do that, you're being really sort of unfair to your fellow actors and to the audience. And I've gotten a bit better at that, but so it was in a weird sort of way. It was like to see if I could do it, and also maybe to give me a vehicle to act in because I knew that I didn't have time to go audition. And so I thought, well, maybe this will be the way I do it. But in subsequent plays, I started realizing that I think I'm better served just by trying to write, and and that was actually very freeing for me. And so that's what happened to it. I mean, it's an amazing thing what you learn, and I find myself having to learn these things over and over again. The mistakes I make writing, which are inevitably brought to light when it's being read or being performed, um, are I think they're common mistakes for a lot of writers, but for me, they repeat themselves over and over again. I mean, in my case, I overwrite horribly. Um, and you forget how much heavy lifting a good actor can do for you without all your words getting in the way. And inevitably, even the stuff I write now, I think I've gotten rid of everything that's excessive, and then I'll hear it, and I'm like, I have not gotten rid of everything that's excessive. But that's part of the fun of it and part of the craft of it, and so I really love it.
And do you have a brain trust, so to speak? It could be family, friends, somebody you can go
I
to,
am so
you know.
lucky. I am so lucky in that regard. One thing I will say for myself is that if I've worked with someone over the years, and I've really admired their talent, but also liked them as people, that I've made a very conscious effort to sort of cultivate relationships and friendships with them, not in a cynical way, but because I really enjoy them, but also, um, there are several actors with whom I have acted, or they've been in plays of mine for like over 10 or 12 years, and we're still in contact. I mean, this online theater company that I'm a part of, a lot of those actors are absolutely part of that. And it's gotten to the point where I will occasionally write plays and I'll think, oh, I think my friend Eleanor Handley would be good in this role, or Carol Todd would be good in this role, or Michael Satow. And these are friends of mine who are also brilliant actors. And uh, they and so I will go to them and say, "Hey, I've written this thing. What do you think?" And they're very smart, and they're very and they're all they're good friends, but they're not going to be flattering to me just because I'm their friend. So I do have a group of people. So it's a small group, but it's a handful of people whom I trust implicitly their judgment um, theatrically, and they've been an enormous help to me, and continue to be.
Oh, that's wonderful, especially having a small group where you
Yeah.
can absolutely trust, "Hey, demolish this if you have to, red mark the
Right.
hell out of it. I
Right.
need commentary." Uh,
Yes.
is there any sort of, I don't know, do you get any feeling where you talk to them about your projects or about scripts they're working on, where
Mm.
you feel that drive to get back on stage and act again, or.
Well, it's funny you mention that because in the past, because recently I've done a little bit of that recently, like in this play, which I will, relentlessly plug at the end of this podcast, and which I may as well start now. It's called Step Nine, and it's a play I wrote, and it's a radio play essentially, but it's released. It's on a in platforms. Any podcast platform you'd go to, you can find it. I'm actually in that play and I was not intending to be, but a couple of my friends um, said to me, I think you should do this. I think you could do it. And so I did, and they were very kind and encouraging to me. And I was in a room with really good actors, and when we recorded it, and so that sort of levels up your game, to be sure. But also, it was a very friendly environment because I didn't walk in saying, "I think I should play this role." It was suggested to me, which is really the only way I ever would have done it. And so an actor in that play, and I may act in things here and there, but I don't have an acting career per se. There are some things occasionally I may jump into now, whereas even 5 years ago that wasn't really true for me for the most part. So I may be finding more of that now as I get older, but um, it generally takes someone I trust to say, "No, you can do it. You should try it." Because I don't think of myself at this point really as an actor anymore.
Yeah, you know what? And it's fun territory with you being primarily a writer now with your
Mm,
education background. Going to Lambda. and acquiring all of that knowledge. Were there any classes in which you were placed into the perspective of the writer when you were attending that school, or
It's a
was it
really good
all
that's a really
dramatic performance?
it was all dramatic stuff, but that's a
Okay.
really good question, but, when you think about it, so many, um, playwrights started out as actors, and I think just, um, being inhabiting those plays it's a pretentious word, inhabiting, being in those plays, uh, so insufferable, being in those plays, um, was all of them were very helpful, and what happens is, through osmosis, you sort of get a sense of how a play should be structured. Not that all plays need to be structured similarly, but a good sense of what makes a good blueprint for a play. Um, because you're acting in inevitably 90% really good plays. And again, also when I was teaching, I wasn't teaching plays that like didn't do well. I'm teaching, Death of a Salesman or Raisin in the Sun or, A Streetcar Named Desire. These are good plays. And so I learned a lot doing that. I think being an actor is actually one of the ways you can, um, best ways you can learn to write plays. And they'll all debate about whether or not Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare or not, and there's a lot of debate both sides. You can't convince me. You can't convince me Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. Um, and there's lots of academic arguments, but to me, the one key to me irrefutable piece of evidence is in the Scottish play. Well, we're not on the stage, so I can say it. Macbeth. There is a moment in which, and spoiler alert, if you haven't read Macbeth, there's some plot twists. There's some spoilers ahead. The scene, Macbeth kills Duncan, and he comes downstairs, and he's in sort of a fugue state, and he's got blood all over his hands. And his wife, emasculates him and says, "I'll go do it." And he's very upset. And there's knocking on the door, and he's covered in blood. And he says, and then he has to go answer the door. And then the next scene, there's the porter who has this monologue, which was very funny in the day, and many people don't understand now. It's basically a lot of sex jokes and being drunk, etc., etc. And then he has a brief little interlude with Macduff, and then Macbeth comes on, and he's fine. That is the exact length of time it takes to wash the blood off of your hands, change your costume, and walk on. And that to me it's not scientific, but I'm telling you, as an actor who in his youth played that role, I would marvel at this had to have been a theater guy. This guy knew I've got blood on my caked on my hands. I need time to get it washed off, and I got to switch, and then I got to walk on, and it's inevitably the exact right timing. So Shakespeare was a guy who knew his theater and a very real workman-like sense of things, like very pragmatic, not highfalutin, not what themes am I going to explore, though no doubt he may or may not have done that, but it was that to me is like a technician, like a workman at work, who knew his craft. And so in that sense, I think being involved in the theater is great, is the greatest possible training for being a writer.
Well, and to speak on that as well, as somebody who grew up mainly on film and,
Yeah, well,
never
me
really
too, by the
acknowledging
way.
theater. Yeah,
Yeah.
honestly, I don't think it was until I saw Fences here in Denver in college,
Mm.
and it's my favorite play to
Oh,
this
August
day. I
Wilson.
absolutely
Yeah,
love it.
please. Yeah.
But I do wanna bring up the movement to bring theater back to, the mass populace and making it less of the, pinkies up, drinking, the
Yeah.
best wine sort of experience and more for
Yeah.
everybody, which, Denver's definitely doing in spades. It's been wonderful. But
Sure.
I wanna get your perspective on bringing theater to the masses in New York City. I mean, off Broadway, off Broadway. I mean, what has that
Yeah.
been like in the last few years?
Well, it's been very well in the past few years. It's been, of course, incredibly hard. It's always hard, right? Theater's always on the verge of dying. I mean, you can just picture someone coming up to Sophocles and saying, "Man, Sophy, wasn't it better 20 years ago? Wasn't it a lot easier? Wasn't it better before these kids are ruining it now?" So I think there's always been an element of that. But certainly, the pandemic was a tidal wave that crushed many elements of our culture, but theater in particular. Um, I think that the unfortunate trend, and I'm hardly breaking new ground here, but I think the unfortunate trend for theater in America anyway is that it's so inaccessible now. And I grew up on Long Island. I grew up about an hour's train ride away from the arguably the center of Western theater in the world, and I didn't. My parents didn't never went to plays. I didn't go to plays. I grew up on TV and films and music, and Elvis Costello and John Lennon and Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen. These guys, they inform my sense of language and writing at least as much as Arthur Miller does. Um, but it's just never been on our radar culturally because of two main reasons. Obviously, one is expense. It's very expensive and more expensive by the minute to go see a play. Even off Broadway now is harder than it was. I had a couple of plays off Broadway in the early teens, and the landscape is very much different now than it was even then, because now you basically need a so-called name or a star to get something done off Broadway. And with Broadway, that's a non-starter. You need stars, and you need a major budget to do it. So the cost is prohibitive, right? You most people can't afford to go see a Broadway show. They can't, and it's mostly on Broadway, it's mostly catered towards the tourist industry, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and it's sort of always been that way. I mean, literally Eugene O'Neill used to complain about it. He called it like the show shop. He's very disparaging about it. But back when the so-called heyday of a lot of American theater, when Williams and Miller and Inge and Lorraine Hansberry were writing, it was something that a lot of reasonably educated people in the city would go see every day, school teachers, clerks, and now it's like it's a super expensive thing. And so that's very prohibitive. And the other thing that prohibits it, I think, is geography. I mean, you're lucky in that Denver does have a really nice, thriving theater community, but that's a rarity. Um, Geography is really a big impediment to that. And one of the things that we're excited about with the online theater company, New Normal Rep, it was formed during the pandemic, initially as a way for all of us just to kind of stay in touch with each other. I talked about those friends of mine who I admire and who are great. And we realized at a certain point that there's actually a really good, it's a good theater company we got going, and we really put some effort into it. And we believe that it's a really nice way of exposing people to theatrical works. It's not theater, obviously, right? There are things about the theater that are unique and wonderful to the theater that require you to all be in one room. That's part of its magic. But we think we found an aesthetic in which you can sort of present a theatrical work as opposed to, say, a TV script or a screenplay. A stage play, which is different. It's more it privileges language more, for example. And what we're very excited about is that all of our plays are either free or very little cost. And if you have internet connection anywhere in the world, you can watch it. And the idea of, and we're not alone in this, but there are a few of us who I think are really, feeding, or creating a hunger and an appetite for something that most people don't even know that they're missing out on.
Absolutely. And I've heard, I mean, I have grandparents who've never really been to a theater. They've been to their
Right.
church plays and that sort of thing for the holidays, and that's about it. But I walked in a couple months ago and they were watching a stage play on TV through, their Roku or whatever plugin they had.
Mhm.
And they said, "Oh, I love it. This is great. We should try to go do this." Like, well, yeah, but I mean, and embrace it now. Like, get
Yeah.
used to the format. So when you go, to check out the theater and see that craft, you have even more of a respect for it. And I do want to ask you, when it comes to recording stage plays and putting them online, doing live streams, things like that, what sort of conflicts or troubles or challenges did you experience while doing that, especially during the pandemic?
Well, great question. Our first season had 4 plays, by 4 different playwrights. I was one of them because, uh, I'm not gonna let I'm a playwright, so I'm not gonna let that chance go by. And it was happened to be the first play we did was one of mine, but, it was directed by Marsha Mason, who is a tremendous Academy Award nominated actress and a brilliant director, and she said to me, "I'm a little nervous about this because I've never really done this," and we both said, "Well, no one has really." And what we had to do is we had to figure out how to make it feel like everyone was in the same room, because when we recorded these plays, this was in 2020, so it was full lockdown. And what we decided on was an aesthetic that I think works in this medium, because it is a different medium than say television or film. You're watching it on a small screen, very small screen. So what we decided to do is we would incorporate, through the use of green screen, the sense that everyone was in the same room, but they weren't talking to each other. Although the characters were talking to each other, obviously, it was being presented where every actor was facing you, like you and I are facing each other now. And what we found is that people would say that it felt to them like suddenly they were like in the middle of the scene. It was very interesting, and it allowed for a sort of intimacy that I don't think we've seen in anything really. I mean, film is obviously a brilliant medium, as it and television is brilliant and different, and that's different from stage. They're all different flavors of dramatic presentation, but they all have their distinct ecosystems. And I think that online plays can be and are often. I think when we've seen them done sort of clumsily because everyone's just trying to figure out how to do it, and or they're watching like grandparents were a videotaped stage production of something, which used to be awful and unwatchable, but people have gotten pretty good at it now. And like for the National Theater does a great job of it, and a lot of other places do too. And so that's really great too. And I think those are wonderful experiences, but they're not quite theater, but they're very close. I think doing something specifically for an online environment, it requires a certain aesthetic. Now, there are only a couple of issues. I mean, like there's a scene where characters kiss, or something like that, or physicalize. You have to write your way around those things, but those aren't impossible by any stretch of the imagination. Um, and for me, for the audio play, the radio play we did, um, we what was interesting was that uh, again, it was a play of mine, and I don't want people to think that this theater company just does plays of mine. In fact, most of the works aren't by me, thank goodness. But we found that for my writing in particular, it lends itself to a radio sort of situation because of the fact that it's very based on language. So there are some works that may not translate well, that are primarily visual in their impact. Mine, as I think you could have gleaned by now by listening to me, tend to rely a lot on words, and so and also it's scenes in which there's a lot of intimacy, a lot of two character, three character scenes. Then there are a few that aren't, but those scenes work very well in these environments because there's a quiet and an intimacy to them.
Yeah. You know what? Building on that, I'm really intrigued. When you were, modifying and revising and restructuring plays for, that specific medium, and then things start opening up, you start going back onto the stage and
Right.
performing that way, writing for that medium itself. What changed after you were doing those recordings and after producing plays from the internet and now bringing them back onto the stage? What changed for you going back to in person?
It's a really good question. The short answer is nothing, and that's not necessarily good news for me. I haven't, um, it's been hard. I mean, I haven't had an onstage production yet since post pandemic,
Okay.
um, but that doesn't mean I really don't. I desperately don't want there to be. I mean, none of us in our company think that well, this is what we're going to do now instead of theater. It's or television. It's going to hopefully be in addition to. I think that um, I think a lot of the same challenges that are there were there before, and even are more so now. Um, for example, if I mentioned some of the plays like Death of a Salesman or Strictly Named Desire earlier, those were written in the late '40s, and the casts are massive. And these aren't musicals; these are straight plays, and they have casts of, and I'm making this number up, but there's like 15 parts, 18 parts. You just can't do that today, and that's always been the case. There's been a paring down and a paring down and a paring down. I had a play of mine called Jericho, which fortunately did very well and was produced a lot. But I had many theater companies come to me and say, "We really love to do this play, but can you get rid of a couple of characters? Can you trim it down? There are too many characters." Jericho has a cast of 6, and yeah, so that's the budget constraints people are dealing with. I had I've had people come say to me, "Can you write just a 2 character play? That'd be great, or even monologue would be ideal," um, because it's budget constraints. And then on the one, so I've always sort of known that. So most of my plays don't have that many characters. In fact, Step 9, the radio play that you're probably already sick of me talking about, um, I kind of knew when I wrote it that it probably wasn't producible because it had 8 characters. So in a way, the radio was the play format was ideal for that because then you could do that. You could have lots of different characters, but that would be unproducible for many people these days. Even if you think about it, the plays that are on Broadway now or off Broadway by big names, there's very few characters in them, um, and it's purely a question of economics. And in a way, it's interesting as a writer. It's like being forced into a discipline, right? Like that's why some poets like writing sonnets because there are rules, and you have to and like fitting into the rules. It's like a game, and that's part of the fun of it, and that's part of the challenge of it. So, and it's good discipline because you should always, create a work with as few characters as possible because brevity being the soul of wit, etc. But you but yeah, but the idea of writing when I've written a couple of teleplays and I've realized, oh, I've got 30 people here, and a lot of them just have 1 or 2 lines. It's a very different animal, and that's very much the same as it always was. Unfortunately, I think that theater hasn't really learned its lesson yet. We haven't found a way to pare things down and make things more affordable. And unfortunately, I think that's unchanged.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem that way, and honestly, with the just skyrocketing popularity of podcasting and
Yeah,
bringing, radio plays back. I know you are going to podcasting yourself or have been in it.
yeah, yeah.
Are you playing around with, splitting time between on stage and then producing radio plays now? What does
Funny.
it look like
Well,
for
I
you?
mean, we hope to produce more radio plays now. To be honest, right now, New Normal Rep, we are in the it's grant season, so we're in the middle of like trying to get grants, and that will sort of
Ah,
determine what we're able to do. We'd love to do more of those. Absolutely, no question. Those are fun. Right now, the project I'm working on currently, one is a play I'm trying to get produced, and the other is a thing I co-wrote with a friend of mine that is basically a true crime podcast, but it's a parody of it.
okay.
Which we haven't seen. I haven't seen too many of those, and yet true crime podcasts are massive. Um, and so we just finished writing a series about the tagline is it's a true crime podcast about an untrue crime, and so it's called the Murderer Killings, and it's just aggressively silly, but done deadly serious, just like has all the tropes of true crime podcasts. So in a way, it's a fun way to explore different avenues of telling stories.
Yeah, I can't picture a true satirical parody of a true crime podcast that
Yeah,
I, know has however many subscribers or follow I can't think of
right.
one. So you're cornering the market on that one.
Yeah. So if anyone's listening to it now, don't do it. so
Well,
so
with
yeah,
your career, your experiences, just this colorful life that you've led within the, performing arts,
yeah.
I'm really curious to see if you have a party story you could share with us. So something that stands out within, your time either on stage or off stage that you could easily tell friends at a party. Could be horrific, funny, tragic.
Oh, I think you meant stories about parties, in which case, if the old cliche is like, if it was that good a party, you wouldn't be able to remember telling it.
Right.
I will tell you something that's absolutely humiliating, that I'll happily share for your audience's, moderate enjoyment. Going back to that very first play I did, I was in it, and it was like the third performance of it, and I knew, because I knew the play, and I knew that like my character's off stage for X amount of time, and I was backstage talking to some other actors, and we were having a good time, and I was telling some story that I obviously thought was very very worth telling and very well done, and all of a sudden, this assistant stage manager says, "You're late. You should be on by now." and it was the setup was that backstage there's no room backstage to talk, so you went to the dressing rooms, which were up a staircase and over, and it was like it wasn't an easy, quick entrance. And I've never lived this down, and my friends who will still tell the story. I mean, the only time I've ever been late for an entrance in a play ever was in my play, which I like, and the third performance of it too. So you would think that I would have still been sort of on my toes about it, but talk about absolute hubris and arrogance. I thought, I know exactly how long I have. Apparently, I didn't. So I came on, and I'll never forget the looks of the actors on the stage who had been madly and apparently very feebly ad-libbing for like which must have seemed like 15 minutes to them. In reality, it was probably a minute, but a minute on stage is forever. And I remember being in college and being in a production of Much Ado About Nothing, and someone it was just me on the stage, a little monologue, and someone was supposed to come in and he didn't. And I had lived blah blah blah. I remember thinking very, like a very jaded, cynical, arrogant 20-year-old thing. Well, I will never do that to another actor. And not only did I do that, I did it to several actors in my own play. So that's if you find humiliation entertaining, then that's very entertaining.
And he's right. Those of you who are listening, a minute on stage is an eternity.
Eternity. Eternity.
Oh my
But
god.
if and, it's long enough for the audience to think, that's weird. And then to think, something's definitely wrong. And so the audience sometimes enjoys it more, but it takes years off the lives of the actors.
Oh my yes, but well, when you came back in, were they able to reroute to the initial
They
conversation?
were, but I mean, man, oh
Okay.
man, the one of the greatest challenges I ever had was looking them in the eye afterwards, just saying, "I'm so sorry. I know." And they were actually very nice people. And they were all annoyed as well as they should have been. But I mean, they all knew that there's nothing they could say that was going to make me feel worse than what I was already feeling. Although they gave it a try. But no, oh God, what a terrible feeling. I still have nightmares about that.
Oh my yeah, I started to get that cold flap sweat as you were talking
Oh,
about it, because that's my worst fear on a set is
it
showing up
is.
late.
It's a terrible thing, that and going up on your lines, is the 2 things, and, I'll tell you another humiliating story because I've got
Yes.
loads of them. Is one of the times in that very first play, and, one of the actors said to me, uh, she was very sweet and very nice about it, she came up to me and said, um, "You're mouthing my lines." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "As I'm speaking, you're very not perceptibly to anyone else, but, like, if I'm looking at it, I can see it, like, you're actually saying my lines, like, silently." Which I've never done with anyone else's plays, but obviously there's some part of writer's brain that's going, "Okay, she says this now, and this is how this line goes." Just, just amateur hour, just absolutely mortifying, to hear that I did that. So, yeah, so those are just 2 of the many, many embarrassing stories I have about myself in show business.
If it makes you feel any better, I found that Bill Hader was doing that till season 2 of Barry. Every script
Really,
he
it does
wrote,
make me
he
feel
would
a lot better.
yeah, if it wasn't his coverage, he would be mouthing and he wouldn't even realize it. They had to tell him to stop.
Yeah, exactly right. I have found the one thing Bill Hader and I have in common. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right, and it's because no doubt because he wrote it, and
Yeah.
that's what it is. You're hearing it, you're playing it out as you're hearing it. Just like when I'm reading, going over a script I've written and I'm reading it, I'm no doubt mouthing it. So when you're writing it, you're always sort of acting it out in your head. And that's probably what he was doing. I wouldn't presume to speak for him, but if I had to guess, I'd say that's what it was. And that's totally what was doing for me. But you have actually made me feel a lot better about that. Thank
Oh,
you.
perfect. Well, I mean, this is a great segue from that topic of conversation to get into any advice that you could pass on to our listeners that you've personally held on to, whether they're starting their career now or they're in it and they're trying to stay in it.
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, you've I would just say very humbly, I mean, just in terms of a career, not that I feel qualified to give advice, but I would say to anyone that you really gotta, the cliche is true, you really have to love it. And if you can think, and you have to also understand that it has no obligation to love you back. And if you're willing to sort of be in that sort of relationship, which in a personal relationship would be a terrible red flag, um, your relationship with the arts is probably going to be, in that sense, not a very even relationship. It's not always going to love you back. It may never love you back. And if you still feel compelled to be a part of it, then you're doing the right thing. Um, and as a writer, all I could say is read and see as many plays as you can, and then read as many books as you can that have nothing to do with you. Just read and read and read, and observe, observe, observe. You're always sort of, the whole everything is source material. Um, and so, and I would also, apparently, I've got several things to advise here. As a writer in particular, and I guess it would apply to acting too, that everything is source material. And the more you are willing to sort of unburden yourself of your secrets and the things that you find most embarrassing or shameful, and the more specific you can get with that, the more universal it becomes. And because, which is a paradox, the more specific you are about a situation and the feeling, especially something that humiliates you, or frightens you, or makes you unhappy, very makes you not feel very proud about how you're feeling. That's usually where the good stuff is.
No.
Not in life. In life, it's a disaster, but on stage, it's I think
Yeah.
very useful.
Yeah, don't do that in life. You will feel 10 times
Right.
worse.
Yes.
No,
Exactly.
I those are all incredibly pertinent. I really appreciate it. And this is, the best part of the episode, the shout outs and promotions, which you alluded to earlier on in the episode as well. But what can I specifically give a shout out to for you in the episode notes?
Well, thank you. I really hope people get a chance to listen to our New Normal Reps audio play, which is called Step Nine. It's the number nine, and if you just go to any of your favorite podcasteries and click in and type in New Normal Rep in Step Nine, it will take you to all the episodes, and we're very proud of it, and we really hope you check it out. We also have a YouTube channel we're very proud of, and right now, Jericho, which is our first full length production, is available for free. Just check it out. We hope you enjoy it. And there's also lots of other small things, little talkbacks with different plays, and some 10-minute plays and a couple of sketches. So there's lots of material there that we're very proud of, and we hope you'll check out.
Oh, absolutely. I know I'm definitely gonna, check out more of it. And when I'm back in New York City, as long as you have a production going on, even if you don't, I'll hit you up and grab a cup of
Yeah,
coffee or something.
absolutely. I would love
Uh,
that.
this has been delightful, man. I have one more thing we have to do before we end the recording, but I do want to
Yeah,
say thank you for your time and just sharing your story. This is the best part about doing this podcast is meeting new people. So, yeah,
thank you. Yeah,
it's
it was a
been.
pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm just glad the coffee hasn't betrayed me yet, as far as like flubbing words or stammering. So that's always a win.
No, you've nailed it. Yeah,
As we wrap up, I do need to ask you: have you ever seen Wayne's World?
of course, of
Okay.
course.
Okay, perfect. So, last step in every single episode of this podcast is what I like to call the awkward goodbye. Similar to, Wayne walking off the set when corporate takes over and Garth is just left there to his own
Yeah,
devices, freaking out. So,
right.
essentially, what I'll do is I'll give you a silent 3, 2, 1 countdown. And when I point to you, give me your best verbal and visual awkward goodbye. Does that sound good?
Oh, sure. Yeah, now you're in my wheelhouse. Yeah.
And you thought you were done acting. Okay, here we
Okay,
go,
let me
Jack.
try. Okay.
In.
Um, so yeah. Yeah. See ya.